All right, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. We'll get started for the second half of the day. So I'm pleased to be able to introduce David Schmoys. David is a professor and director of the Center for Data Science for Enterprise and Society at Cornell University. He has a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley and was chair of the Cornell Provost's Radical Collaborations Task Force on Data Science. He does a lot of work on design and analysis of efficient algorithms, especially approximation algorithms. He is co-author of a book on the design of approximation algorithms, which was awarded the 2013 Informs Lanchester Prize. That's a very hard prize to win, I know, because I tried to win it twice and didn't succeed. So, and he's done a lot of work on bike sharing and other sort of applications of OR. David.
Thank you, and many thanks to the organizers for the invitation. And I'll start with an apology. There'll be very little ML and no supply chain, but it's certainly a subject of recent topical interest. So I'm really pleased to be given the opportunity to talk about this work. So I'm going to be talking about the ongoing process that is occurring as we speak, in which each state in the United States is determining congressional districts for the upcoming 10 years. And this is, of course, embedded in the Constitution that every 10 years we must do this. And what's worse, every state is left to their own devices to decide how they're going to do it, though, of course, Congress may, at any time by law, make or alter such regulations. So this gives you a sense of the scale of the complexity of what's ongoing, is that there are 428 congressional districts, 1,938 state senate districts, and 4,826 state house districts that are in the process of being redrawn. So this is an algorithmic question. But it's sort of thing, you have to first ask, well, it's an algorithmic question, but what are the most appropriate goals? And what are the mechanisms by which we can achieve that goals? And I'm going to be trying to compress into the remaining 40 minutes highlights from two papers. One which is really about optimization tools, and one which is a little bit more definitively about thinking outside the traditional box. So if one just thinks about redistricting, what are the potential desiderata? There are sort of two natural things. One that might be, and this is not universally accepted by any means as being an important desiderata, is proportionate. That if I look at a given state, there are two quantities that are relevant here: the vote share of a given party, and I'm going to be thinking in a simplified U.S. framework of two parties that are splitting the vote. And we'll think about party vote share as being, let's say, VP, and you might think about how does this translate to the seat share, which I'll denote by WP. So proportionality says that those two should closely adhere to each other. Though there are other notions of fairness that one might want to be thinking about as well, which I'll briefly touch on later. And embedded in sort of the U.S. sensibility, and this is very much a U.S.-centric kind of view, that the district should reflect geographically cohesive communities. And this leads to notions of compactness that have been embedded in some amount of legislation. So local representatives should live close to the represented. The colors aren't great. But that shouldn't be too important. So here we have two maps of North Carolina. On the left, on the one hand, this is not a particularly compact map. You have these little long, leafy districts that you can see delineated there. In comparison, the map on the right is relatively compact in terms of the kinds of districts that are drawn. But the left is proportional, whereas the right one is not proportional. And that there are other desiderata. I mean, one might want some notions of competitiveness, that elections should be close. If elections are close, that prevents polarization. And it should be responsive, that if the vote share changes somewhat, then so should the seat share. And all of these are different characteristics, and they're not by any means exhaustive in thinking about that. So there are two distinct challenges that I want to draw attention to. One I'll call intentional gerrymandering. So in this case, and this is the one which gets the most visibility is in the intentional drawing of a map to favor one party. So the standard graphic is there, which gives rise to the notions of packing and cracking, that we imagine we have 50 precincts that are being divided into 5 districts. Let's imagine that each of those precincts is either 100% blue or 100% red. But overall, we have then 60% blue and then 40% red. If we take the drawing on the left, we have cracked the red vote sufficiently so that blue has complete control. On the other hand, by disproportionately sort of packing into a limited number of districts, the figure on the right shows that actually red can maintain control in spite of being a minority party. This is not a hypothetical. This is a map of North Carolina, which is roughly a 50-50 state in terms of vote share, but seats, and this was a map that was later thrown out, that Republicans controlled 9 out of 13 seats. So this is not a hypothetical. This is what partisan gerrymandering, intentional gerrymandering, can do. But it's not the only kind of gerrymandering that's relevant. I'll also talk about natural gerrymandering, where the distribution of voters makes it impossible to draw proportional maps that are at least satisfying some limited notion of compactness. So this is often referred to as the Massachusetts problem. Republicans have 30% of the statewide vote, but configuring districts so that they can get 51% in a single district is really something that requires unnatural maps to be drawn. So this is also an issue if indeed one is accepting the principle of there. So let me just sort of set up the framework of some notation that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll be talking about it in a relatively rigorous and mathematical way. Let's take, in this case, the map of Nebraska. So at the core, we have a collection of smaller population geographic entities. They may be census blocks, they might be fine-grained levels of precincts at voting, where typically we would know election by election the actual outcomes of an aggregate of how many people voted each way. We can build the Voronoi dual of that. We can put a node for each of those geographic units, and we can think about notions of adjacency with respect to the planar map, and just imposing it on that. So here we have sort of at the core, and I can think about then the input to the problem as in fact starting with those blocks, but that underlying adjacency graph, which have the nodes as being blocks and edges that reflect adjacency. The edges are geographic entities. They have Euclidean distance. And then, of course, there are 2 key parameters that come into play. The number of districts. So in case of Nebraska, there are 3 districts that result. And because, of course, one of the things that is embedded in the Constitution is that the districts should represent relatively balanced numbers of people. That, of course, isn't going to happen exactly, so there's going to be a parameter epsilon that provides some measure of population balance. So we have constraints that are population balance. One requirement is that they should be contiguous, that, you know, that if this were really landmass, you could walk from one point in any one point in the district to any other without going through another district, and they should be compact. And there are many notions of exactly what do I mean by compact. One, for example, that gets used quite frequently is the ratio of the perimeter to the area of the district. But I'm going to be interested in sort of thinking about the juxtaposition of 2 objectives. The notion of compactness, which typically has served as a proxy for making sure that gerrymandering isn't occurring, and an explicit notion of fairness, which is a bit trickier to model. So, and of course the output ultimately is a k-partition of the graph. This is a hard problem. It's NP hard, but more to the point, it really is hard in practice from there. I mean, there are easy NP hard problems. This just isn't one of them. There's a long literature within the OR community and within the applied mathematics community more generally in treating a number of approaches to them, to this problem. This is by no means sort of breaking new ground. So at the core, as an integer programmer, this is an easy problem to state, that I can build a very standard integer programming model. This is, as I just described it, a kind of constrained set partitioning problem. I have an underlying set of population units. Let me just keep calling them census blocks for simplicity. And I have some notion of a collection of census blocks that could be a feasible district that comes within the population bound and satisfies the contiguousness of the district, and is reasonably compact. So, for example, in this very stylized state where I have 32 perfectly rectangular census blocks, I might have that upper left corner be one proposed district, and I can just think of encoding whether or not a given census block is within a proposed district as a binary 0-1 vector, indicating the yellow being the ones and the darker shade being the zeros. And so I can think about just giving a complete enumeration of all feasible districts. The beauty of mathematics is I can just think about it. D1 through Dn are all possible feasible districts. And now, as I think about really what I want in terms of constraints, that if I encode that enumeration then as a constraint matrix A, where I have B blocks and N different districts as defining the size of the constraint matrix, that I can just introduce a 0-1 decision variable. Am I going to use that district, that potential district? And then I have sort of the partitioning constraints that says that each block should be covered exactly once by the selection of xj's, and that we have to choose exactly k districts. So it's absolutely trivial integer programming formulation. Of course, the problem is that mythical complete enumeration of feasible districts, but this gives rise to something that we've handled in other settings many times before. One thing that's kind of different and interesting in this context, that is, if you think about given, and here I'm just writing out the feasible set of that set partitioning formulation, that one thing that's sort of relevant here is that as I view the size of that feasible set, that's sort of saying for a given set of columns that I'm thinking about, for a given set of potential districts, how many statewide feasible plans am I generating? And if I think about restricting attention to a particular enumeration, partial enumeration of the sets, that may have very different properties in terms of what happens. And so one measure that I'm going to be thinking about is thinking about sort of how many different feasible solutions I get versus how many columns I start with, how many potential districts. And that's a notion I'll call the leverage. So indeed, this is the set partitioning integer program I just talked about. And the thing that resonates when, first addressed, and I bet Andrea Lodi tomorrow is going to talk about using formulations like this in a range of problems, that as long as we can generate the right columns on the fly, generally speaking, we can do reasonable things with those integer programs. Unfortunately, in this setting, I don't know how to generate the columns on the fly. So I don't know how to do partial enumerations, solving there, and generating what else I need so as to make progress. So that's more or less what I just said. So what am I going to do instead? So what I'm going to do instead is outline a simple method, a very natural method, to generate a robust set of columns that I'm then going to optimize and actually be able to repeat many times. So this is a heuristic for generating formulations that then we each give rise to, albeit an NP hard problem, but a relatively tractable integer program that we can then solve and then look at the ensemble of solutions that result. So a rather different perspective. So indeed, that's what this figure is supposed to do. We're going to first generate lots of columns, and then we're going to optimize. And there's sort of two aspects. For good solutions, we need a good basket of districts. But on the other hand, in the end, we're going to have to optimize it. So we should better, have some sense of tractability there. So here's the main idea on sort of one slide, but I'll go a little bit more in depth of what we're going to do. Take the state of North Carolina. It has 13 districts. What I'm going to do is do many random replications. So I'm going to create this branching of random replications of a partitioning of the current region. At the root, it's the entire state, but as I go down this tree, it's going to reflect a subregion of the state. And each subregion is going to have an associated number of seats, which will have to be computed in an inferred way. And then, so we're going to have multiple replications, and so there's going to be a replication factor. And how many regions? Notice that here I've split it in this case in 5 regions, this case 2, in this case 4. So there's going to be a splitting factor for each replication. I'm going to make also a random decision so like in this case, I'm splitting this one region again into 4 regions. In this case, I'm splitting it into 3 regions, and so forth. And so I'm going to just keep propagating this down. In each case, splitting the region both geographically and in a kind of proportionate way, allocating the total number of seats that were at a given node to each part in each designated child, until ultimately at the bottom I have a leaf node which represents only one district. So, and I'm happy to take questions. So please feel free to interrupt and ask if something isn't clear. So one of the good things about this is that this gives rise to a structure which we're going to be able to have compositionality. That as I think about different parts of the solution, they're going to sort of be designed to be able to mix and match. So there are going to be trade-offs between the different random parameters that I want, that it's been tuned to that the number of subregions that each region goes to is between 2 and 5, and the number of replications that we do. So there's this fan out with the number of partitions that I generate and the split size Z that are key parameters. But this figure sort of shows why this actually works in generating a rich set of columns. Imagine that what I'm showing here is the first root split of this into 2 regions, and then this subregion on the left is then getting split into areas that as I further partition within each of those, I can mix and match any redistricting within one subcomponent and really corresponding to any subtree with a corresponding other solution. And so this gives rise to an exponentially rich set of statewide district plans that result from a relatively limited number of columns. Relatively limited here is I'll typically generate something for a state like North Carolina, generate something like 1,000 columns. And of course, the root is, maybe it's not of course, the root is a little different. And so rather than actually do multiple root things that are built into one master IP, we actually just resolve the IP from the different root branchings. So yeah, so this is the key point, that everything on the left side is composable with everything on the right. Every partition in the top quarter is composable with every the bottom quarter, and so on. And this gives rise to a very rich solution. So here's a graphical depiction of a potential enumeration, something like 2,000 columns for the state of North Carolina, depicted. And you sort of can see geometrically that in terms of where the ones and zeros are, it's very understandable that there is this composability. How do I do the partition, first of all? So I just magically said that I take one region and I partition it into some number of regions. So I start out with a region R, and actually what I'm going to do first is I'm going to choose some centers of those regions, and that'll give me the ability to understand in terms of proximity of population the appropriate capacities that I want to ascribe to that. So now I'm going to partition the region R into some number of subregions that take the given number of representatives associated with the master region and partition those out. And so we're going to then have so this is a sub-integer program, if you will, at each stage of the tree. That what we're going to do is try to understand that for each block J, which of the centers does it get assigned to? This is kind of a dispersion effect that tries to minimize the dispersion. And this is where I'm building into the model that we're maintaining compactness. So this is ensuring that as I take one region and do a partition into subregions, that the regions that result are compact. So rather than putting compactness in some sense into an overall state of the master state plan, we're just doing it and driving it in terms of the kinds of districts that we're building overall. As the rest of the integer programming modeling is quite, the sorts of things that one could assign to an undergraduate modeling class. Every block has to be assigned to some center. There should be some, I guess I really have, there should be some balance of the population so that the number for the total population of blocks that get assigned to each center is within a tolerance of balance. And then the tricky thing is to get contiguity in. And this is an old trick. It goes back to the paper of Malhotra et al. That says basically that if I assign block J to center I, then amongst its neighbors in the adjacency graph, one of them must also be assigned to I. And so in this way that we can do that, and not only its neighbors, I can keep track of those that in the number of edges distance to the center with respect to that original graph, it should be one that's one closer overall. And that's what gives rise to the fact that we're building contiguous districts in terms of how we do the partitioning. So this is, again, not new to us. This is a partitioning model that's been around. So far I haven't talked about fairness in the slightest. So let me sort of say that, but this exactly, by going to the set partitioning formulation, this allows us to capture notions of fairness that are not linear in the census block level, that we can capture things that are holistic with respect to proposed districts. So one thing that we could do, for example, is to minimize the difference between the statewide seat share and the statewide vote share. And to do this, and to get some sense of on what data I want, and here's sort of where the minimal amount of ML comes into play, is we're going to use historical data to infer a stochastic model on the voting outcomes at the census block level 1, and then infer from that at the proposed district level. So suppose I denotes a proposed district. We're going to have, using the technology of Gaussian processes, we're going to have a normal distribution of a given mean and variance of the vote share, let's say for one party. And then consequently, of course, if that's the stochastic model, there's an analogous stochastic model of the resulting random variable that is the seat share, which is just the Bernoulli that vote share is at least half in a proposed district. But linearity of expectation then allows us to add this up over a range of proposed districts within the state. And it also allows us the mechanism to say that this is going after true proportionality, but we could have a different sensitivity function of, as I think about the role of a given seat share, we really can put any mapping of seat shares onto the 0-1 interval so as to think about what actually should be the kind of concentration we're looking for. And so this allows us that if I look at a map and I look at a proposed district, this allows me to posit that with some probability the resulting, what is the probability that this resulting district is going to vote one way or the other. And so this allows us to embed within our set partitioning formulation exactly this cost. So that, again, if I think about a given proposed district J, and it has this posited stochastically inferred random variable of a vote share and seat share, that this then becomes the cost of that district. And it's signed, of course. And what I want in terms of the fairness is I want to minimize the absolute value, right? So that more Republican is, in terms of that difference, is going to be one sign, more Democratic is going to be the other. And what I want in achieving let's say I had H being the identity and minimizing the proportionality gap, I just want to minimize the total difference between the expected seat share and expected vote share. So this gives us a formulation for building in fairness into the optimization model. Okay? Oh, and then I'll walk you through all of that. Let's look at some results. So this is actually from that North Carolina thing. And we can run this many times. This is a randomized procedure to generate columns that all of the plans that I'm generate will be more or less, relatively compact, but some will be more compact than the other. Here, because I'm talking about just the same state of North Carolina, what I'm using as a measure of fairness is just the total district perimeter, adding up over all the districts that proposed. So you see that there is significant variation in terms of this best. So this is each of these points represents the optimum to a different set partitioning formulation. Now notice that these proportionality gaps are all good. This is in relative to North Carolina, where the proportionality gap that was legislated was 5. So this is all in the between 0 and 1, and you see this trade-off. And in its now sort of usual language of the kinds of things that ML has made us used to, as we think about such a trade-off curve, let's look, thinking about the elbow is always a reasonable thing to do. So indeed, this is the elbow map that results of something that's relatively compact and nonetheless achieves a very good proportionality gap. So this is a tool that can be implemented, and we've done it across all the states. One thing to put in contrast to this, that the tree that I constructed is also useful if you happen to be dealing with a purely linear objective. So like minimizing fairness is such a thing, because I essentially take the absolute value out of the term. You can just use the tree structure and actually don't worry about any integer programming. You can just do it by dynamic programming. So this allows us to do a full statewide ensemble building of understanding. Now, probably the scale of the room and the scale of the slide is hard to read, but what you're seeing here is that, for each state and I'll focus here on Massachusetts, that there's the average seat share that we generate. So like every other normal, reasonable compact plan, that there are no Republican seats. Here's where the models, that's true in terms of what the average seat share was from 2012 to 2018. Here's the range that we can generate, and here's really where true proportionality would be. So we're still not able to hit proportionality, though we come a whole lot closer in terms of what we can generate overall. So there, if you sort of think about things in aggregate across the US, we're still keeping everything compact. So people looking at the map would think these aren't gerrymandered. These are reasonable districts. You can still affect between a 43 and a 62% Democratic seat share overall, just by doing the optimization this way. You can you can control on the expected number of seat swaps in trying to measure notions of competitiveness within these districts. And only 15 states admit a genuinely proportional plan amongst the things that we generated. So the good news is we can do a lot better. The bad news is we're still coming up short of proportionality. So I'm going to change gears and talk about something that goes directly and thinks a little bit out of the box and give you some highlights. So there's another bill that's languishing on the floor of the House that proposes the following, that rather than thinking about one district, one representative, so New York, let's say, has 27 districts, instead think about multi-member districts. So instead think about 9 3-person districts. Those 3-person districts will still have to be compact. They still will have to be contiguous. And what the bill proposes is that, well, how do you determine 3 winners across that? Use ranked choice voting. And I'll talk about a mechanism which is known as single transferable vote, that is one way of implementing ranked choice voting. And again, this bill says exactly that each of the states that have 6 or more representatives should establish districts such that 3 to 5 representatives are elected from each district, and that the fewer ones just are completely at large. Okay. So is this a good thing? And computationally, what does this mean? And of course, we now have tools to exactly calibrate what results. So first, let me just say a quick thing about how I do the elect n people. Well, one thing you could do is winner takes all. That you could just say each voter gets n votes, and the top n vote getters are elected. That's a bad idea. And I'll talk a little bit about single transferable vote, which takes into account ranked choice voting. So imagine that we're running an election where there are going to be 3 winners. There are 6 candidates, 3 from each party. And imagine that what these percentages reflect, and here I'll show you round 1, are the percentages of top choices currently. So currently, initially, is in the initial vote. Armando Perez is at 27.2% and so forth. Now, if you think about I'm electing 3 voters, then if I have more than a quarter of a vote, then I really should win, because there can't be 3 other people that are each better than me. So anything above 25% is slop, and we didn't really need those. So Armando is going to be declared a winner, and then we're going to redistribute all the excess above 2,500 to those persons' next choice. Now, of course, we don't know which one, so we'll just do it proportionately in a fractional kind of way over the full 2,500. And that allows us to get a new round of votes. If there isn't someone that clears 25% here, there isn't, we knock out the lowest person, and then we redistribute their votes in terms of their next choice explicitly. And then we can continue this way until we get 3 winners. So this is single transferable vote. It has lots of nice properties. In particular, it says that more or less proportionality happens. So one way that one could do, if proportionality were the only goal and we didn't care about local representation, is we could just do single transferable vote, where you get, a resident of California gets to vote for, to choose their full 53 representatives amongst however many choices. Now, of course, that gives you the hint of why that isn't practical, but nonetheless, that gives another mechanism. So I want to be mindful of the time. So let me just give you the punchlines, and I'll show you some of the data that goes with it. The punchline is, by going down to 3-person districts, we can achieve near proportionality across the board. So it's even just still keeping 3 representatives per district, proportionality still results. And perhaps equally important, the ability to create partisan gerrymandering is strongly mitigated. So if I look at the analogous charts from what I showed you from the single person, the separation between what the most democratically constructed seat and the most Republican constructed seat shrinks drastically. So we're getting sort of two different wins there. And the point is that we have then the computational tools to do this and understand the impact across the nation. Let me show you a hint of the data. So this is inhibiting partisan gerrymandering. Now, of course, so this is averaged across all the states. And so the thing to look at is that nationwide, we're just a slightly democratic overall proportionality. And as I think about, well, here is the 2-member districts, and here is the 3-member districts, that as compared to what the gap looks like at the single-person district, we're limiting that range almost in half. And that's what, partisanship says. One thing to bear in mind, don't do winner take all. That only accelerates and exacerbates the ability to do that in the multi-member district. And in terms of the natural gerrymanders, here are just a sample states. Here is Massachusetts as example, that as we go down in the number of districts and have multi-member districts, so there the proportionality line is there. At 1, we can come pretty close, but we get, by going down to Massachusetts was 14, so here is the 2-member district, here is the 3-member district. We get very close to the proportionality and limit the full range. So, and here is the same sort of aggregated across the nation that, of course, if we, the average proportionality gap is greatly improved. Okay, so maybe I'll skip over the rest. So this isn't a pipe dream. There are places where multi-member districts that happen at the state legislative things. We've actually been pointed that the city of Palm Springs, for its city council, might be amenable to this. Our belief is that we start at the grassroots, that HR 4000 isn't going to get passed. But there is a mechanism here that could show how our modeling and our tools can actually do a lot of social good. And with that, I'll have you say questions. Okay, questions?
I had a question about the partitioning, the tree partitioning algorithm.
Yep.
Does that cover all potential districtings, or could you miss some districtings because of the...
You are certainly going, because the contiguity results are, in effect, building a certain kind of implicit tree structure on it, and that itself places some limits, because it's not, if I look at the kind of underlying trees that could come from any spanning tree of a district, we have restrictions there. So we do not generate all. But of course, part of the thing is we do want to generate a restricted set, because this is where we're enforcing compactness.
But you could have something that's not very compact in the initial level, but then every sub-district is super compact, even though the initial cut is not super compact.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, I'll explain more with a figure.
Okay.
Anybody else have questions?
Yeah, there's a question of the Zoom. So why do you use absolute value in objective impulse or infer fairness?
So the balance between seat share and vote share is a signed quantity. And so if I think about a tilt towards one party, it's positive, and when I imagine that it's a tilt towards the other party, it's negative. And this is, of course, then summed over all of the districts created for overall. So if we were truly proportionate, then the signed sum would be 0, and if I didn't take into account the one party minimizing would be as negative as possible, and the other would be as positive possible. So in the absolute value exactly captures the notion of aiming towards a fully proportionate solution. And one thing I didn't mention is that, of course, we all know the usual integer programming or linear programming modeling trick that allows me to get rid of that absolute value and by adding an additional variable.
Thank you.
Thank you.